Welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this tutorial episode, I am going to explain how I created the lioness artwork. This is one of the few artworks that I have a pattern for sale on my Etsy page along with the reference photo, and I will put a link to that in the description below. Well, let's get started. Eyes and forehead. Burn a dark line around the edges of the eye using either the razor edge of the shader or a writer pen tip. Then start blocking in the dark fur or maybe its skin adjacent to the eye. I am using uniform strokes as my burn method for this. Afterwards, lightly burn over the eye, but avoid the area of reflected light. Then block in what little we see of the left eye. If it is easier, use a writer pen tip for this. Next, start blocking in the fur around the right eye. For this I am burning either zigzags or single lines. I've got my pen tip angled so that I'm using the edge of the shader as I burn. The shader edge is very thin, so this produces a really thin burn stroke that is similar to what you would get using a writer pen tip. It might be easier to use a writer pen tip and burn lots of single lines instead of zigzags. Regardless of the pen tip or method that you use, it is important to use a light hand pressure when burning. This will help keep the pen tip from sinking down into the wood's surface. The smaller or thinner the pen tip is, the more likely it is to happen. So that's why it's really important to use a light hand pressure when burning zigzags. When I'm working on the dark area of the eye, since it's not fur, I'm using the flat of the shader. I'm not burning zigzags on the eye. I reburn over the eye area several times to slowly build up the color. I prefer doing this versus burning at a higher heat and getting it done in one burn session. The reason is that dark burns are very hard to fix. So that's why I prefer to block in at a lighter color. Once I'm comfortable with how the area is looking, then I can darken it up. Right now I'm burning zigzags over the trace lines as I work my way around the face. The trace lines indicate the edges or seams where the color of the fur changes. This can be due to markings or even shadows. It is important to burn the zigzags in the direction that the fur is growing. And this rule applies if you're burning single lines instead of zigzags. These lines are creating the foundation of the fur, and that's why it is important that they're burned in the direction the fur is growing. In addition to burning over the trace lines, I've also been blocking in a couple of these small patches of darker fur here and there. After that's done, it's time to start blocking in the fur. I like to work on the darker areas first. This way it is easier for me to match up markings with the reference photo. As I mentioned before, I am using the zigzag burn stroke to create the fur. When I'm working on the darker areas of the fur, I reduce the space between the zigzag lines. This means that less of the underlying wood is visible when I'm burning the zigzags, making the burn stroke darker in appearance. With the lighter colored fur, I increase the space between the lines, and this allows more of the underlying wood to be seen, and that makes the burn stroke lighter in color. I have a video where I cover more ways to alter the zigzag strokes to create different effects or colors on the fur. In the video, I create the faces of 4 different house cats to demonstrate the techniques I'm explaining. I will put a link to that video in the description below. Watching the video, you can see that I continue to slowly build up the color on the darker fur by adding more layers of zigzags over the fur. Each time I reburn over an area, I also burn over more of the adjacent wood. This starts the foundation for the lighter colored fur. This approach builds up the shape of the face while maintaining the darker areas. That is important because it makes it easier for me to match up features with the reference photo. When you create fur texture, make sure you keep the edges of the markings soft. Markings do not have crisp edges. There are always adjacent hairs that overlap onto the marking, and hairs on the marking that overlap onto the adjacent fur. For example, there is a white band of fur under the eye. A green arrow is pointing to the spot on the reference photo. I burned really short zigzags that overlapped onto the edges of this band. That breaks up the line and it gives the area more realism. This rule applies for color changes too. You do not have crisp, hard lines in fur. I do want to remind you that if you're not comfortable with the zigzag burn stroke, just burn single lines instead. It is important to do what works best for you. I prefer to use the right edge of the shader as I burn because it's easier to see where I am burning. If you are right-handed, then most likely you'll be using the left edge. Sometimes the fur is growing in a direction that makes it difficult to use the preferred edge. When this happens, if the area is small, I just angle my hand in a new position to make it easy to burn. But if the area is large, then I rotate the board because that's going to be a lot more comfortable. Now you won't have this issue if you're using a writer pen tip or something similar to that. One thing you cannot see in this video is how many times I pause burning to consult with the reference photo. I cut these numerous pauses out from the video because they don't serve a useful purpose in the tutorial. I mention this because creating realistic art requires checking with your reference photo, so I encourage you to do this and do it often. I've gotten my shadows and darker fur blocked in. Now I'm working on burning a layer of zigzags over the rest of the fur. I also reburn over some areas of the fur. When working along the top of the head, make sure some of the hairs stick out further than others. You want the edge to be a bit jagged. The lines that stick out represent the stray hairs that stick out on the reference photo. Even though this is a minor feature, it adds to the overall realism of the fur. A slight jagged edge is also needed along the bottom edge of the ear. The reasons are the same as the top of the head. It breaks up the line and adds subtle realism to the artwork. Earlier, I encouraged you to consult with the reference photo often as you're working. Something else I encourage you to do is to work on your art at different angles, like upside down. Doing this makes it harder for your brain to recognize familiar shapes, and that makes it easier to concentrate on the tonal values of the area. Another benefit of rotating your work is that it can help you figure out problem areas. You'll notice things that you didn't see before. I encourage you to work for a little while in one direction and rotate the board in a different one and work for a while in that direction. And when you rotate the board, make sure you rotate your reference photo to match the board. Since I'm recording my work, I try not to rotate the board often because it's unpleasant to watch. When I'm off camera, I rotate the board regularly. I find that it really helps me spot problem areas. It also helps me check my tonal values. The more difficult the subject matter is, the more beneficial I think this technique can be. I am almost done blocking in what I'm going to cover in this chapter. Once that is done, it is time to start the reburning process. This just means I reburn over the fur to build up the color and texture, and that is done by using the same techniques I used to block it in, so I will be burning layers of zigzags. Each layer of zigzags adds more tonal depth and darkens up the fur. And I think this process of slowly building up the layers of fur is what adds to the realism. Since I'm just reburning over the fur to darken it up, there isn't anything new to explain. So I'm going to play music until I get to the part where I finish up the eye. That happens near the end of this chapter.
I'm in a hurry to get where we're going, so slow down. Baby, let's do this right. Who knows where these winds are blowing? I don't care, I'm with you tonight. I kinda like you sitting next to me. I kinda like it, everyone can see. I kinda like it when you hold my hand. I kinda like it, how you understand me. I never knew it could be like this. Don't need to find anything to do. I could stay here, taste your kiss. I never think about anything but you. I kinda like you sitting next to me. I kinda like it, everyone can see. I kinda like it when you hold my hand. I kinda like it, how you understand me. We'll be the talk of the town, we'll turn it upside down. Baby, there's no doubt, I'm a moth to your flame, you know I have no shame. Let's give them something to talk about. I kinda like you sitting next to me. I kinda like it, everyone can see. I kinda like it when you hold my hand. I kinda like it, how you understand me.
I am using a writer pen tip to darken around the eye. I apologize for how blurry the video is. I burned a line through the reflection to break it up into two segments, the right segment being the larger. Then I continued to darken the eye and define that reflection. Also, I lightly burn over the reflection. In retrospect, I don't think this is necessary because I think that the bright white would help the eye stand out better. I am using small circular motion and some uniform strokes as my burn method to darken up the eye. I am leaving a small round area below the reflection as a brown color. The rest of the eye will be dark brown to black in color. Nose, mouth, and cheek. Start by burning zigzags or single lines along the shadowed side of the nose. Then burn lines just above the nostrils. Afterwards, fill in the top of the nose with the zigzags or single lines. We are going to burn in the top of the nose from the line that is approximately 1 inch up from the nostrils. I have marked the line on the reference photo with a green arrow. The fur on this portion of the nose is darker than the fur that's above the line. Burn a dark wide band of color along the top and left edge of the nostril opening. Then burn zigzags along the lower edge. We are defining the outer edges of the nostril opening. After the edges of the nostril opening have been defined, then burn in the nostril opening to a dark brown color. I'm using uniform strokes as my burn method for this. Now burn circular motion along the right side of the nose just above the opening to create the shadow found there. Extend the color along the dark area above the nostrils. On the reference photo, this area is darker than the nostrils, but lighter in color than the openings. Now block in the nostrils and the dark area below the nostrils. I am mostly using circular motion for this, but I do use some uniform strokes. Reburn over the nose fur to darken it up and soften the transition from the shadowed right side to the top of the nose. We want the area to get gradually lighter. Be aware that there is a slight depression near the top of the nose. A green arrow is pointing to it. This depression needs to be a touch darker than the surrounding fur. Continue to reburn over the nose to darken it up. I am using the same burn strokes I used to block it in. With the fur, I'm using zigzags, and on the nostrils, I am using either uniform strokes or circular motion. When you work on the nostrils, be aware that the right edge of both sides of the nostril should be darker than the left edge. Also, the bottom should be darker than the top. I am using a medium ball tip to burn a layer of tiny dots over the entire surface of the nostrils. You can use a writer pen tip to do the same thing. I add more dots on the right side than I do the left, and more on the bottom than the top. The purpose of the dots is to help create the slightly bumpy texture that most animal noses have. If you don't care for how it looks, just skip this step. I did not add dots to the nostril openings. Instead, I was using circular motion to darken them up. I'm burning on plywood, and the ball tip got down into the nooks and crannies of the plywood better than the shader did. I used the ball tip to darken up the right edge of the nostril. This creates slight shadows that help give the nostril a rounded edge. I burned either dots, short lines, or tiny circular motion. Then I switched back to a shader and reburned over the nostrils to darken them and further contour them. This will also reduce the appearance of the dots, making the texture more subdued. The last thing I did was darken up the fur as needed. For this, I'm using the razor edge of the shader and burning more zigzags. Now let's work on the cheeks and whiskers. I'm burning really short lines along the bottom edge of the cheeks. The lines start in the dark mouth opening and stop a short distance on the cheek. Avoid burning over the whiskers when you approach them. Speaking of the whiskers, I used an embossing tool to create them. I just pressed the tool firmly over the pencil lines to create whisker-shaped channels or gouges into the board. I used the large end of the embosser first, and then repressed over the whiskers with the smaller end. This was done to make sure I had deep gouges in the wood that would remain even if I burned over them. Then I rubbed over them with a pencil eraser to remove any residual graphite. Darken up the inside of the left cheek. Use the shader and burn stroke of your choice. We are not creating a texture, so any burn stroke will work to darken up the area. Rotate the board if needed to keep your pen tip in optimal position when burning along the edges. This will help prevent overburns and keep your lines crisper. Lightly burn along the outer edge of the left cheek. In areas where the cheek is indented, make the color a shade or two darker. Then burn along the bottom and right edge of the cheek. With this first layer of color, I used circular motion. After that, I used zigzags or single lines as my burn strokes. I started out with circular motion because the fur is so pale and it's hard to see any texture on it. Lastly, I reburned over the entire cheek. I made sure to lightly burn over any unburned areas. Use a shader, ball tip, or even a writer pen tip to create the dark spots on the right cheek. After creating a spot, darken up the fur around the spot. Just keep that fur much lighter in color than the dark spot. Then extend the lighter color until it touches the ring of lighter color on the adjacent spot. When creating the spots, make sure they are not perfectly round. If you examine the reference photo, you can see the spots have irregular shapes to them. Now we are going to darken up the fur above the first long row of dots on the cheek. For this, I continue to use the razor edge of the shader to burn thin lines in a zigzag motion. Keep in mind that my zigzags are shaped more like bolts of lightning versus a sewing machine zigzag stitch. Back to the row of spots on the cheek. I like to work one row at a time. I burn in the spots and then add the fur texture between the last row of spots and the current row of spots I just finished. If you would prefer to burn in all of the spots before doing the fur texture, then please do so. Either approach will produce great results. It is important to avoid the embossed whiskers, especially when burning in the same direction as the whiskers grow. The reason is that the pen tip can easily slip down into the groove and darken the whisker. When burning in an opposite direction of the whisker, this isn't as much of a problem, but you should still be careful. I've got most of the cheek blocked in. Now it is time to reburn to build up the color and add some fur texture to the small unburned area. With that area, I first burn in the shadows. This is nothing new or unusual. One area of note is the lower right side of the cheek. This area is circled on the reference photo. It has a lot of shadows, and those shadows really help give the cheek a lot of its shape. So when you work on this area, make sure to incorporate those shadows. Make sure the color gradually transitions into and out of the dark shadows. What I mean by this is that the shadows should not have clearly defined edges. Instead, the color should get gradually lighter as you get further away from the shadow. I often refer to these as transition zones. In some areas, like the folds of skin below the eye, the transition zone is pretty small. Two more things. First, make the fur on the cheek get gradually darker as you approach the shadowed right side of it. Second, make the color of the fur darker along the spots on the cheeks. Between the rows of spots, the fur should be a couple of shades lighter in color. Be aware that it might be necessary to reburn over the spots to keep them dark in color in relationship to the adjacent fur. The very last thing I did on the face was use a writer pen tip and burn along the outer edges of the whiskers. I did this to further define the edges and to reduce their width. This pen tip was small enough to reach down into the bottom of the embossed lines. This allowed me to lightly burn over the whiskers to reduce their brightness. Burn a line around this section of gums near the back of the mouth. Then block in a small area below it. Burn the area below to a dark color. Afterwards, burn over the section of gum. I am mostly using uniform strokes as my burn method, but I also use some circular motion. I lightened the reference photo to make it easier to see the details in the mouth. Block in the dark skin on the inner cheek along the right side of the mouth. Burn the left edge of the skin so that it is lighter in color than the rest of the skin. This is just to help the edge stand out. Do your best to avoid the whiskers so that they remain light in color. If you do darken them up, it's not a problem. You can use the tip of a sharp knife to remove the color. I'm burning along the pattern lines, and I added a horizontal line on the gums. For some reason, I switched to a ball pen tip and I'm burning circular motion on the gums above that horizontal line I just created. I'm guessing I did this to add subtle texture to the area. Either that or I was trying to see if the ball tip would work better on this piece of plywood. I had written a note about this artwork that I absolutely hated this board I was burning on. As I finish up the dark right side of the mouth, notice that the left edge of the cheek is slightly lighter in color than the right. Keep the edges of the lip jagged. The lip is the transition where the skin ends and the fur begins. The light-colored lines will become the random hairs that form the fur that is starting to grow in the area. After the dark right side is blocked in, or mostly blocked in, then burn over the pattern lines. These lines mark the edges of transition zones where the color changes or sometimes the texture changes. The back of the tongue is darker than the front, and the left side is darker than the right. The edge of the tongue is lighter in color than the top. This is all due to shadows. Start by blocking in the top of the tongue. I'm using uniform strokes and some circular motion as my burn methods. Don't worry about getting the color perfect right now. We'll be reburning over it later. I switched to a smaller shader just because it makes it easier to work around the front teeth. The gums on the front of the mouth are more complex than the side. That's because there are a number of highlights found in the area. My way of dealing with this is to slow down and block in the gums to a lighter color. That way, as I assess and compare my progress with the reference photo, I can fix any problems that I see easier. I know I've said this numerous times, but I will say it again. Lighter colored burns are much easier to fix than dark ones. Rotate the board when burning next to the top edge of the teeth. This will put the pen tip in optimal position so that the edges of the teeth remain sharp and clean. Always rotate your reference photo to match the orientation of the board. I'm using the razor edge of the shader to burn very short dark lines between the teeth. It might be easier to use a writer pen tip for this. Then resume blocking in the gums, using whatever burn stroke you prefer. I continue to use uniform strokes as my main burn method. I'm stippling in the middle of the light-colored flesh at the base of the right canine. Once everything but the teeth are blocked in, then it's time for reburning. As you probably guessed, that means we just reburn over the mouth to darken it up until it gets to its final needed value. Use the same burn strokes for the reburning that you used for the blocking in. Also, it is important to continue to consult with the reference photo often during the reburning process. The reason is that the reference photo is what you use to determine how dark to burn the area. I'm burning really short pull-away strokes along the bottom edge of the tongue. The stroke starts on the bottom edge and gets pulled up towards the top. Stop the stroke near the halfway mark on the edge. This will help give the edge of the tongue a rounded appearance. Then I burned circular motion along the edge to darken and soften the transition. Then I resumed darkening the top of the tongue. Now I'm using a ball tip and burning circular motion over the tongue. I think this was done to try and darken up the thin pale lines that are forming on the plywood. All plywood does this, but this particular piece of plywood was really bad. Afterwards, I'm stippling over the surface of the tongue to give it texture. Stippling is just a fancy word for applying a layer of dots over an area. The tongue in the reference photo has some curves and dips to it. I did not capture that in my artwork. Instead, my artwork took a simpler approach and created a fairly flat-looking tongue. I sped up the video quite a bit because all I am doing is reburning over the gums to darken them up. I'm using the same burn strokes I used to block them in. The only thing going on right now is that the color is getting darker. To get some dark and slightly blotchy color, I'm pressing the pen tip to the board and holding it in place for a fraction of a second. Basically, I'm stippling with the shader, but the burn results are irregular in shape. Both canine teeth are yellow-hued except the small area around the tip. I'm using uniform strokes as my burn method. I use uniform strokes and circular motion along the base of the small teeth. My board has a grain line that's running through the right canine. I'm doing my best to darken around that line so it won't be as noticeable. I made the left canine darker than what the reference photo shows so that it would stand out against the pale background. The right canine has the tongue and gums behind it, so it easily stands out. The chin has some small patches where the dark skin shows through. I burned several short lines clustered together to represent these dark patches when I burned over the trace lines. Begin by reburning over these dark patches. I'm using the razor edge of the shader to burn a series of single lines. I also created some lighter colored patches along the front of the chin. Next, start blocking in the shadows found between the clumps of hair, or locks of hair, if you will. A red arrow is pointing to one of the shadows I'm referring to. Since the fur on the chin is white, the shadows are not very dark. Use the flat of the shader to lightly burn over the fur just under the lower lip. This fur isn't very thick, so the dark skin shows through a little. When I create the longer shadows, I have my pen tip angled to use the toe or front of it. This creates a thicker line than using the razor edge does, but a thinner line than using the flat of the shader. I am using a white charcoal pencil by Generals to draw in the wispy chin hairs. This makes it easy to see the hairs so I can avoid burning over them. I always get asked if some other brand or a white pastel pencil or even chalk will work. I don't know, so I recommend testing it out on a piece of scrap wood. You want to make sure that whatever you're using will erase completely and that it does not char if you accidentally burn over it. After the white charcoal is in place, then burn in the background behind the chin. Avoid the white charcoal. It will resist the heat of the pen tip, but it won't block it completely. Since the fur is white, the background must be burned in so that the fur will be noticeable. Let me stipulate that this is my preferred method on handling this situation. There are a number of artists who use white-colored pencils or paints to create the fur. I have tried that, but I never cared for how it looked in my artwork. I erased the charcoal, evened out the background, and extended the color to the dark border on the board. Now I'm reburning on the background next to the chin hairs. This darkens the background, and that helps the hairs stand out. It also further defines the hairs. During this process, I also thin the hairs and shape the tips to a point. As you can see, I am also reburning over the chin to darken it a little, further define the pale shadows, and define areas where the dark skin peeks through. Occasionally, I use the razor edge of the shader to burn some thin, slightly darker lines in the chin. These break up clumps of fur and add tonal variety. Make sure the background remains darker than the chin fur as you work. How dark should the background be? Well, that's your personal choice. At the very least, it should be dark enough to still have contrast after a finish is applied to the wood. To check, I spritz water on the board with a bottle mister. This gives me a good indicator of the color change that will happen when a finish is applied. Don't do this if you did not wet out the board before you started burning. A line divides this board. The right side was sanded, and the left side is how it looked before I sanded it. Here's how the sanded side of the board looked after I misted it with water and let it dry. This side is now rougher than it started out. I wasn't happy with the contrast level, so I let the board dry completely, then burned some more on the background. And I will continue to do this until I'm happy with how the white fur on the chin is standing out from the background. You might wonder why I didn't burn the background to a really dark color. The reason is that it would create a very high contrast spot. This would cause the chin to become the unintentional focal point because our eyes are drawn to areas of high contrast. With this artwork, the focal point is her eyes, not the chin. The last thing I did on the chin was use the edge of a sharp knife to create some thin, wispy hairs. I did this by gently scraping away the background where I wanted a wispy hair to be. Here's how the chin looked on my artwork after I was done. The rest of the face in this chapter requires nothing more than burning in layers of fur. The fur requires more layers near the ear where it is darker. There are also some shadows under the jaw and a few wispy hairs along the front of the throat. Since I have already covered how to create fur texture and wispy hairs, you have everything you need to burn in this small area. That is why I have sped the video up a lot. To me, there's not a lot to cover here. The ears. Begin with the left ear by burning a series of thin single lines to block in the dark streak. Then burn a series of thin lines along the right edge of the ear. These two areas are the darkest areas on the left ear. Afterwards, re-burn over the streaks to darken them up. Also, burn in the area from the first streak to the right edge of the ear. Make sure to vary the length of the wispy hairs that stick out along the edge of the ear. Once the darker right side is done, then start blocking in the rest of the ear. The fur is considerably longer on the rest of the ear, so make sure to increase the length of your burn strokes. Also, the rest of the ear is lighter in color, so burn it several shades lighter than the dark streaks are. This little area at the base of the ear has short fur, so I'm using a short zigzag stroke to fill it in. Now that the ear is blocked in, I'm using the flat of the shader to burn thick bands of color on the ear. This will darken and soften the appearance of the fur. Since I'm not going to burn in the background behind the ear, I'm making the color on the ear darker than the reference photo. This ensures the ear will be easy to see on the artwork. Depending on your situation, you may need to do the same. Begin by burning along the pattern lines to define some of the different hair groups on the lower ear. I am using zigzags as my burn method for this, but you can also burn a series of single lines. Afterwards, block in the lower hair groups to the right of the dark ear opening. Then burn the dark wispy hairs along the outer edge found on the right side of the ear. Basically, we are blocking in the lower right side of the ear at this time. After blocking in the area, I re-burned over the lowest hair group to darken it up. I know this section of video is a touch blurry. My apologies for that. In this step, we are burning in the dark ear opening. There are a number of wispy hairs that stick out around the edges of the ear opening. For the ones on the right side of the opening, I use a zigzag burn stroke to create them. Along the left edge of the ear opening, I carefully burn around the pattern lines. I will mention that it might be easier to draw in the wispy hairs with a white charcoal pencil first. White charcoal makes it easy to see what you need to avoid burning. Using the charcoal is the same technique that we used on the chin. Also, I highly recommend working slow. I'm burning the ear opening very dark. Keep in mind that I feel very comfortable working on the ear because I've done a number of animal ears over the years. If you are unsure of yourself, then lightly block in the ear opening. Once it's blocked in and you're happy with it, then reburn over it to darken it up. Here's how the ear looks. Be aware that I don't have video of this part of the ear being burned in. Now burn in the dark wispy hairs along the outer left edge of the ear. Then start blocking in the different hair groups on the right side of the ear. When I block in a hair group, I start the burn stroke at the base of the hair. I use a fast hand speed as I work so that the color fades slightly as I near the end of the hair. This creates a bit of gradient shading and helps each hair group stand out. I am mostly burning single lines, but I occasionally use a zigzag burn stroke. My pen tip is angled to get a line that is approximately double the width than the razor edge of the shader would produce. I leave little gaps between the lines. This provides tonal variety and adds realism to the fur. When I work on complex things like a furry ear opening, I concentrate on small areas at a time. For example, with this ear I started out working on the lower right base of the ear. Then I moved to the right side of the ear. Then I moved to the dark opening of the ear, etc. As I work on these small areas, I ignore the rest of the ear. Breaking the ear up into smaller sections makes it less intimidating to work on. Plus, that makes it easier to do. The fur along the bottom of the ear is short in length. I marked the area with a yellow circle on the reference photo. Also, there is a split where the fur changes directions. Along the split, the fur is dark, but the fur adjacent to it is lighter in color. Make sure the seam where the fur on the ear touches the fur on the rest of the head is slightly jagged. To make the fur jagged, burn several short lines that start on the seam and extend a short distance into the fur on the ear. I rotated the board a little bit to make it easier for me to burn the fur along the right side of the ear. I'm reburning over the fur in this area to darken it up. I'm not burning very dark. My main goal is to get the outer edges of each hair group darkened up because currently they look white. As I work, I do make sure that I keep the base of each hair group darker than the ends so that the groups can be differentiated from each other. As you can see, I'm reburning my way around the ear as I darken up the fur. I'm also adding short lines that vary in color to create small shadows that break up larger clumps of fur and make the fur look more intricate and complex. I varied the direction and color that I burned these lines in. These lines create the impression of hairs overlapping onto one another. That adds more realism to the fur found around the ear opening. Once I finish the ear, I will have ended up reburning over the ear 3 to 4 times. Each time I darken the overall color, I further define some of the wispy hairs, and I add a number of short burn strokes to create the impression of some hairs going in random directions. Creating this type of detail takes time. Speaking of time, I want to emphasize the importance of taking your time. I have the video sped up, and this makes it seem like I didn't spend much time on the ears. I actually spent several hours working on the ears, and most of that time was spent on the right ear. Plus, I worked off and on the ears over several different burn sessions. And all of this is just to point out how important it is to take your time. Rushing through things is not going to produce good artwork, so slow down and take your time. Did my ear turn out exactly like the reference photo? Heck no! If you're watching my video to try and learn how to create an ear, then chances are your ear won't be an exact replica of the photo either. That's okay. Our goal is not to create exact photo replicas. Instead, our goal is to create fairly realistic artwork. And keep in mind, no one is going to compare your artwork with the reference photo. So relax, take your time, and try to enjoy the creating process. Neck and body. Begin by burning zigzags or single lines along the pattern lines. The pattern lines mark spots on the neck where the fur has parted and there is a shadow. A red arrow is pointing to one such shadow on the reference photo. After you've burned over some pattern lines in an area, then burn in the rest of the fur. Just make the fur lighter in color than what you did for the pattern lines. On some of the pattern lines, I burned thin lines with crisp edges. I don't recommend doing that. Later on, I will have to fix these lines and make them jagged. Save yourself the extra work and create semi-jagged lines to begin with. With this large dark shadowed parting of the fur, I'm creating the jagged edges by burning dark lines that start in the dark shadows and extend a short distance into the pale adjacent fur. So obviously it is possible to fix the crisp line issue, but it just adds extra work that could easily be avoided. Right now we are blocking in the area. This is the same thing we've done in all of the chapters thus far. I'm using the same zigzag burn stroke. If you don't like using the zigzag stroke, then burn single lines. If you compare the neck to the rest of the body, there are two minor differences. I'm calling the differences minor because they are easy to deal with. The first difference is that the fur is slightly longer than the face or the rest of the body. To deal with this, I just increased the size of my burn stroke. So this means I'm just making a bigger zigzag stroke, or burning longer single lines. Secondly, there are a number of areas where the fur is ruffled and there are shadows where that fur parts. All this means is that we need to make this shadowed fur a couple of shades darker than the adjacent fur. I have often found areas that are complex looking are much easier to handle if you break them down into smaller parts. The lioness is that way. As I work on the neck, I am concentrating on one small area and ignoring everything else. A small area consists of one or two shadows and the fur adjacent to them. Once that small area is blocked in, then I move to a new small area. This technique of breaking down the subject matter into smaller parts makes burning the lioness less intimidating. As I block in the neck, I am using a very loose or open zigzag burn stroke. This means that there are big gaps between the zigzag lines. To put it another way, you can see a fair amount of the underlying wood between the burn strokes. A loose zigzag burn stroke creates an overall lighter colored fur. This is perfect for the neck because the neck is much paler in color than the body. In the shadowed areas, I reduce the distance between the zigzag lines. This produces a darker overall color. Of course, reburning over an area will also make it darker. When I was working on the lower part of the throat, you may have noticed I burned some semi-dark, thin, long curved lines. These lines create some of the smaller shadows and form the boundaries of some of the smaller locks of hair. Right now I am burning a number of lines and small clusters of lines to add a touch of color and give texture to the fur. The dark fur that is below the neck will be covered when I explain the left side of the body. When I'm burning in the ruffled fur on the throat, I alternate between using the razor edge and the flat of the shader. I use the razor edge to create really thin lines that gives the fur a very fine short hair texture. I use the flat of the shader to create wider bands of color that soften the fur and create small locks of fur. With the bands of color, I start the burn stroke in the shadowed area and stop at the end or near the end of the hair group. I also vary the color a bit to provide tonal variety. The neck is blocked in, so now I'm reburning to further define shadows, hair groups, individual locks of hair, create more jaggedness along the edges of hair groups, and to darken the overall color of the fur. I used the same burn strokes during the reburning phase that I used during the blocking in phase. The longer fur you see at the bottom of the neck, or maybe that's the beginning of the chest area, will be covered in the next chapter called the left side of the body. Yes, I am aware that I create amazing chapter names that inspire awe and wonder. Names that make you want to jump to that chapter just to find out what it will cover. Well, wonder no more because we are there. Begin by burning a series of long single lines or long zigzag strokes along the base of the neck. Start the burn strokes on the dark fur and extend them into the pale neck fur. Vary where you start and end the burn strokes. If it is easier, use the same technique that we used on the chin. To do that, draw in the pale wispy neck hairs using a white charcoal pencil. Then burn on the dark body fur, but avoid the white charcoal. With the really dark fur on the shoulder, shorten your burn stroke length because the fur isn't very long. You know, watching this video, I just noticed I'm burning this fur in the wrong direction. I angled the fur towards the right. It should be angled towards the left. You might wonder why I don't use white charcoal all the time when creating wispy hairs. I mostly use the charcoal when I'm having a difficult time visualizing the hairs, and that is mostly due to guidelines. For example, I didn't have very many guidelines on the chin. Sometimes I still burn my trace lines too dark. The trace lines are what become the guidelines. Since the chin was so pale, I didn't want to chance messing it up with guidelines that were too dark. On the neck and the right ear, I had a lot of guidelines, so that made it much easier to visualize where the wispy hairs were. That said, do what works best for you. If you find drawing in the wispy hairs with charcoal makes things easier, then use that method. As I work on the dark fur on the shoulder, I am burning really short zigzag strokes. If you prefer, you can also burn single lines. When I burn along the seam of the two hair groups, I am burning longer zigzags and/or single lines to create the wispy hairs on the lower edge of the upper hair group. The zigzag burn stroke is shaped more like a bolt of lightning versus a sewing machine zigzag stitch. I have my pen tip angled so that I am using the razor edge of it. This produces a very thin burn stroke. When I burn on the slightly longer fur on the hair group above the shoulder, I predominantly use the flat of the shader. The razor edge creates a thin, fine texture. The flat of the shader creates a wide, softer texture. Another way of comparing the two burn widths is that the thin burn strokes represent 1 to 2 hairs, whereas the wide burn strokes represent an entire lock of hair. Along the edges of hair groups, it is very important to vary where you start and stop your burn strokes. The variations will create a jagged border along the edge of a hair group. This is what gives the look of stray wispy hairs overlapping onto the hair group below it. Also, the upper edge of each hair group should be darker than the bottom. This will do three things. First, it creates a shadow. Second, it helps differentiate between the hair groups. And third, it provides contrast so that the wispy hairs really stand out. On the front of the neck, along the lower area, or maybe it's the beginning of the upper chest, there are several large locks of fur. To create a lock of fur, begin by blocking in the fur adjacent to the lock. Burn the adjacent fur darker than the lock. Afterwards, you can add color and texture to the lock by burning over it. I skipped over the shoulder being worked on because all it needs is a couple of layers of zigzags or single lines to create a short-haired fur texture. The right side of the body will cover this texture in more depth. After blocking in this hair group, I reburn along the upper edge to darken it. I start each burn stroke on the upper edge and let it fade away a short distance from the starting point. This creates more contrast so that the wispy hairs stand out. Also, as I'm working, I'm burning thin lines along the upper edge to further define and create smaller wispy hairs. We all have areas on our artwork that we aren't overly happy with. Well, at least I always do. With the lioness, that area is the section I'm currently working on, the lower neck or upper chest. And I'm not sure why. I think part of the problem was I didn't care for this board I was burning on, and by the time I got to this point, I think I was just tired of this project and was rushing to finish it up. Which is what I'm also doing with this section of the tutorial. I'm running out of things to say about this ugly chest area, so I'm speeding my way through it so that we can move on to the final chapter. And speaking of the final chapter, we are there. This last chapter is the easiest. All we need to do is burn either zigzags or single lines on the right shoulder and body. There are a couple of pattern lines on the shoulder. The first marks the outer edge of the shoulder. The second marks the transition where the neck starts and the fur gets lighter in color. Make sure to burn jaggedly along both pattern lines. In fact, all of the pattern lines on the body should have a jagged edge on them. Creating a jagged edge is a simple matter of burning a number of the zigzags or single lines past the pattern edge. Vary how far past the line you burn and how often you do so. Another important thing when burning either zigzags or single lines is to make sure to burn them in the direction that the fur is growing. Also, the fur is very short on the shoulder and body, so make sure to reduce the size of your hand movement. It is important to vary the start and stopping points of your burn strokes. In areas where the fur is darker, you just need to apply more layers of zigzags or single lines. I have my pen tip angled so that I'm using the razor edge of it. This produces a very thin burn stroke. And since the metal is very thin, it can easily cut into the wood surface. The deeper the metal cuts into the surface, the harder it is to burn zigzags. To minimize this problem, use a very light hand pressure when burning. There are several ways I can angle the pen tip. I can tilt my hand forward so that I've got the front edge angled more towards a 90 degree in relationship to the board. I can also rotate the pen tip so that I am using either the left or right edge of it. Depending on the direction I'm burning determines which edge I use. When the fur is more horizontal in direction, it is easier to use the front edge. If the fur becomes more vertical in direction, then I find it easier to use the left or right edge of the shader. I have sped up the video considerably because the style of burn stroke doesn't change. The increased speed will allow me to get through the video faster and still allow you to see the progress being made on the body. As I've been working on the shoulder and body, I've been blocking in the area and then doing some reburning over the same areas. I've especially concentrated the reburning on areas that are darker, and that is to replicate the darker fur that's found in the reference photo. As I'm burning the zigzags, I vary where I start them. I also vary how fast I move my hand, which changes the color. Another thing I do is leave little gaps here and there. All of these things contribute to the tonal variety, and this increases the realism. The tonal variety is not extreme. Instead, the tones are within several shades of each other. Now that the fur on the right side of the body is blocked in, it's time for the reburning process. In a number of areas, I've already done some reburning, but I need to continue reburning because the fur is not as dark as I want it to be. Now I will tell you that I omitted some video footage where I already reburned over most of the fur. The video footage that I'm sharing with you now is the final reburn. I am lightly tapping the pen tip to the board, similar to stippling, but I get a short dash instead of a dot. This darkens and gives the fur a slight coarse appearance that I think I see in the reference photo. Ignoring the small area where I tapped the pen tip to the board, all of the burning and reburning was done using either zigzags or single lines. I applied 4 to 6 layers of burn strokes on the right side of the body. Of course, more layers were applied where the fur was darker. As I finish up the lioness, I want to reiterate the need to take your time. Also, consult with the reference photo often. And most importantly, have fun. This is a hobby to enjoy, not a job to dread. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you found the information informative and easy to follow along with. As I said at the beginning of the video, the pattern and reference photo are available on my Etsy page, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. Also, on my website, Pyrography Made Easy, I have a lot of free patterns and written tutorials to help you with other projects. I'll put a link to my website in the description below. The lioness artwork was burned on birch plywood, and it took me 10.5 hours to create it. Well, thank you so much for watching my video, and I will see you next week.